Today we're going to start The Things They Carried. I think this is one of the most frequently read books in high school, oftentimes junior year. I just want to tell you that it is fiction, but it reads very much like a memoir. And sometimes it can be difficult to remember that this is historical fiction about the Vietnam War and what it meant to be serving during that time. But the author, Tim O'Brien, did serve in the Vietnam War, and a lot of the descriptions of his character in this book seem like they could be true. I will link in the comments some articles that talk about his approach to writing this novel, which I think might help teachers and students understand how this is truly fiction and not a memoir. It is a loosely compiled group of short stories, but they read like a complete story. So if any of you have read The House on Mango Street, I would say it's similar to that, in that these are short. In fact, some of these chapters were published on their own before they were in the book, but it does link together as a complete story. So because of that, I think it's important to keep some notes for yourself about who these characters are. And so I want to show you in the beginning, there's a lot of commentary here. In the beginning, I'm starting to write down names of characters as they come up in places where I can keep some notes, because I do think that teachers oftentimes will want to quiz you on who these people are and their role in the story and their relationship to Tim O'Brien himself, or the character Tim in the book. And some of these people are for sure modeled after people that he knew when he was serving. So the first chapter is called The Things They Carried, and I do believe this was also first published as a standalone sort of essay. So it starts with First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross carried letters from a girl named Martha. So this is our first character that we're introduced to. And a lot of times teachers will ask you in class to remember some of the things that the soldiers carried. And so you'll see that I definitely have some things underlined that represent what they carried. Sometimes teachers too will ask you, if you were to go away to war, or even just to some place where you could only bring a few things, what would you carry? Like if you were to go to camp for the summer, like is there something special from home that you would want to take with you? So it's just a way of making connections to the reality of being gone from home. And in this case, gone from home a very long time. The Vietnam War went on for 20 years. The United States did not get involved until about 10 years in, starting in 1965. But, 58,000 plus U.S. soldiers died in the Vietnam War during those 10 years or so, or maybe 8 to 9 years that we were heavily involved. And if many of you know that there have been a tremendous amount of sort of historical records of the various protests and things that happened in America during that time. Hopefully your teachers will also show you some movies about the Vietnam War, which will help make this a little bit more relatable. So First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross has a girlfriend back home named Martha. She is in college in New Jersey, and even though her letters come frequently, and he will describe the fact that she signs them Love Martha, they are not officially dating. He wishes they were dating. We'll sort of get a sense of that. While he is serving, he imagines what it would be like to be with her. He imagines romantic camping trips. He wanted Martha to love him as he loved her, but the letters were mostly chatty, elusive on the matter of love. She was a virgin, he was almost sure. She was an English major at Mount Sebastian, and she wrote beautifully about her professors and roommates and midterm exams, about her respect for Chaucer and her great affection for Virginia Woolf. So this is the kind of person she is. I could see teachers asking, like, what does Martha write about? She writes about, her professors and what she's reading. And what is Martha studying? She's an English major in college. And all she says about the war in her letters is for Jimmy to take care of himself. She doesn't say anything else. It talks about the weight of the letters. And so he is carrying these letters with him, and they weigh something. And we will definitely see a lot of references to weight, because they have to literally carry everything that they need on their backs. They are hiking primarily through the forests of Vietnam through rice paddies and fields and, landmines and all kinds of things. They're not, getting moved around in trucks and tanks and stuff like that. So they're very much on their feet. It's a very brutal war. They also talk about things that they need. Obviously, like can openers, pocket knives, heat tabs, which is interesting, wristwatches, dog tags, which is their identification, mosquito repellent, because the bugs are terribly aggressive in places like Vietnam, chewing gum, candy, which is interesting that that's as important as a can opener, cigarettes, salt tablets, packets of Kool-Aid, lighters, matches, sewing kits, military payment certificates, sea rations, and 2 or 3 canteens of water. These items weigh between 12 and 18 pounds. So that's just think about, any of you have ever gone backpacking. Think about what it means to carry things on your back. Here's another character, Henry Dobbins. He's a big man. We'll find out later that he's the machine gunner because he's big. He likes peaches, so he carries canned peaches. Dave Jensen, who practiced field hygiene, carried a toothbrush, dental floss, and several hotel-sized bars of soap. Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried tranquilizers until he was shot in the head outside the village of Than Cay in mid-April. So I just want you to notice the way this is just casually embedded in the rest of the descriptions about what people are carrying. Oh, by the way, he was shot in the head. This is how we will see death discussed throughout this book. Death is so common when you are fighting in a war that you become desensitized to it, and it just becomes like another thing that happens, and that's sort of how this is presented here. It says here that until he was shot, Ted Lavender carried 6 or 7 ounces of premium dope with him, which was a necessity. Mitchell Sanders, the RTO, this stands for radio telephone operator. There are going to be a lot of abbreviations in here that we don't necessarily know as people who are not serving in the military. So I'll try to give you some of these as we go along. Norman Boker carried a diary. Rat Kelly carried comic books. Kiowa, a devout Baptist, carried an illustrated New Testament that had been presented to him by his father, who taught Sunday school in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. So Kiowa, this is a Native American name, but he is a Baptist. He carries a New Testament, part of the Bible. As a hedge against bad times, however, Kiowa also carried his grandmother's distrust of the white man, his grandfather's old hunting hatchet, necessity dictated. So he carries things from his family as well, because he is not entirely part of white society. He still identifies very strongly as a Native American and feels a little bit uncomfortable at times, as we can infer this from here, that you can't trust the white man, and yet he is serving in this war. Because the land was mined, SOP stands for it was standard operating procedure for each man to carry a steel-centered, nylon-covered flak jacket, which weighed 6.7 pounds, but which on hot days seemed much heavier, so this is to protect them, almost like bulletproof, only it's more like if they step on on some sort of a small explosive. But you could die so quickly, each man carried at least one large compress bandage, usually in the helmet band for easy access. So they're prepared for injury. Some of their nicknames, they're called legs or grunts. That's just an expression, a nickname for what they call themselves. They also carry something was to hump it. So this is another military expression, as when Lieutenant Jimmy Cross humped his love for Martha up the hills and through the swamps. In its intransitive form, to hump meant to walk or to march, but it implied burdens far beyond the intransitive. So humping it means to carry, literally, but it also means the emotional weight of what you're doing. Almost everyone humped photographs. They all have pictures from home. Lieutenant Cross carries 2 pictures of Martha. We're getting the sense here that Lieutenant Cross is a little obsessed with Martha. And then here we have an example of how obsessed he is with Martha. He wonders about who took the pictures of her and what was she doing at that time and how she's standing and what she's wearing, her white gym shorts, her legs, which he is sure are the legs of a virgin. So she's only just over 117 pounds, so she's little. Lieutenant Cross remembered touching her left knee in a dark theater, and she didn't like it. She turned to him with a sad, sober way that made him pull his hand back. So she's definitely very innocent. She's not necessarily interested in romance at the time that he meets her. The movie they're watching, when he thinks back to that date, which would have been obviously a while ago, was Bonnie and Clyde. So that might also be a possible quiz question. Here's something very important, and I think here's what's difficult about this particular chapter is that we're getting just like the generic description of what soldiers do, what soldiers carry, but at the same time, we have the beginning of a plot with Jimmy Cross and his obsession with Martha and Ted Lavender. So Jimmy Cross carries a compass, maps, etc. He carried a strobe light and the responsibility for the lives of his men. And I think this is important to underline. As the RTO, this is a radio and television operator, Mitchell Sanders, carried the PRC-25 radio with a 26-pound with its battery. So it's very heavy. You can just imagine hauling that thing around. Rat Kiley is a medic. So I'm putting some of these things in my little notes over here. You'll see that I'm saying wherever the heck I put it. Here. Jimmy Cross is the leader. Henry Dobbins is the machine gunner. Ted Lavender is the one who dies. Rat Kiley is the medic. Mitchell Sanders is the radio operator. So as we get these things, just try to write them in for yourself. Henry Dobbins also carries the M60, which weighs 23 pounds because he's the one who carries the machine gun, and that's what it weighs unloaded. He also carries 10 to 15 pounds of ammunition across his chest and shoulders. So he is laden with ammunition and weapons. As PFCs are Spec 4s. Okay, so PFC is private first class. This is specialized fourth or something. I'll put it in the notes. I can't remember what that is. But these are basically, they're lower class within the Army. They are not the most, decorated soldiers. They are common grunts, and they carry the standard M16 gas-operated assault rifle. This weapon weighs 7.5 pounds, unloaded 8.2 pounds with its 20-round magazine. So we're getting all the details of their weapons. I don't know. Sometimes teachers make kids add up the weight. Let's just be confident that it's just a lot. It's a lot of pounds. So then we have a description here of Ted Lavender. Ted Lavender, who was scared, carried 34 rounds when he was shot and killed outside of Than Cay, and he went down under an exceptional burden, more than 20 pounds of ammunition, plus the flak jacket and helmet and rations and water and toilet paper and tranquilizers and all the rest, plus the unweighed fear. So all these things didn't save him when he got shot. He was dead weight. There was no twitching or flopping. Kiowa, who saw it happen, said it was like watching a rock fall or a big sandbag or something, just boom, then down. Not like the movies where the dead guy rolls around and does fancy spins and goes ass over tea kettle. Not like that. Kiowa said the poor bastard just flat fuck fell. Boom, down, nothing else. It was a bright morning in mid-April. Lieutenant Cross felt the pain. He blamed himself. This is important. So first of all, Kiowa's response to this death and the way he talks about it is important. He's making a joke about it. He's laughing. He's being sarcastic and casual, which seems crude and inappropriate to us, for sure. This is also important. Lieutenant Cross blames himself. They stripped off Lavender's canteens and ammo, all the heavy things, and Rat Kiley said the obvious, the guy's dead. Mitchell Sanders used a radio to report one U.S. Killed in action, which is KIA, and to request a chopper. Then they wrapped Lavender in his poncho. They carried him out to a dry paddy, established security, and sat smoking his dope. So all the drugs he was carrying, all the marijuana, they just sit and smoke it. Lieutenant Cross kept himself. He pictured Martha's smooth young face, thinking he loved her more than anything, more than his men. Now, Ted Lavender was dead because he loved her so much and could not stop thinking about her. This could be true. Could be true. So they go on again with the other kind of weapons they carry. They carried catch as catch can at various times. They carried M14s. I mean, these are all different kinds of weapons that they carry besides the basic that they've been issued. Handguns. Lee Strunk carries a slingshot. You know, there's another name. Just try to grab these as we can. Mitchell Sanders carries brass knuckles along with his machine gun. Kiowa carried his grandfather's feathered hatchet. That's important. Every third or fourth man carried a Claymore anti-personnel mine, 3.5 pounds, with its firing device. They all carried fragmentation grenades, all sorts of weapons. In the first week of April, before Lavender died, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross received a good luck charm from Martha. It was a simple pebble, and they do believe in good luck charms. A lot of times they carry, little things like rabbit's feet and stuff like that. Just anything. I mean, think about it. Anything to make you feel safe. We're going to definitely get a good sense of the psychological toll of war, how scary it is, how difficult it is to do this. And when you think about how long our American men were in Vietnam, it was a very, very long time. And so anything that would bring comfort would help them mentally and emotionally. So Martha has sent him a pebble, a very tiny pebble. And she had written in the letter that she had found the pebble on a Jersey shoreline, precisely where the land touched water at high tide, where things came together but also separated. It was this separate but together quality, she wrote, that had inspired her to pick up the pebble and to carry it in her breast pocket for several days. Lieutenant Cross found this romantic because to her, she says it's like a token of her truest feelings for him. And of course, he doesn't quite get it. What does that mean? Separate but together? Well, I mean, we could think to ourselves that, they're literally in separate places, but they're still together as a couple. But he's not entirely sure what that means. And I'm thinking to myself, she's just trying to be profound and poetic because she's an English major. But she's a poet with the poet's sensibilities. Her feet would be brown and bare. He imagines her walking along the beach. On the march, though, through the hot days of early April, he carried the pebble in his mouth, turning it with his tongue, tasting sea salt and moisture. His mind wandered. He had difficulty keeping his attention on the war. So this is showing that he's sort of becoming distant and he's not doing his job. It goes on, it shifts back again to what they carry. They carried variation, of things based on the mission. So if they're up in the mountains, they carry mosquito netting and machetes and canvas tarps and extra bug juice, which is like Kool-Aid. If a mission seemed especially hazardous or if it involved a place they knew to be bad, they carried everything they could. In certain heavily mined areas where the land was dense with toe poppers and bouncing betties, these are different kinds of little explosive than the landmines, they took turns humping a 28-pound mine detector, a way to sort of find where there might be bombs. With its headphones and big sensing plate, the equipment was a stress on the lower back and shoulders. Kiowa always took along his New Testament and a pair of moccasins for silence. Dave Jensen carried night sight vitamins high in carotene, which is interesting. We have other things here. Henry Dobbins carried his girlfriend's pantyhose wrapped around his neck as a comforter, sort of just good luck charm. Their mission to search out and destroy the elaborate tunnel complexes in the Than Cay of South Chu Lai. This was a common occurrence, and so I'm hoping that your teachers will show you pictures of what the tunnels look like in Vietnam. These were very scary places. The hard thing about the Vietnam War is that you didn't know who your enemies were. Viet Cong were infiltrated in all parts of society, and so sometimes people who seemed like they were just ordinary, purveyors in the marketplace or whatever would become enemies at night. And so, you never knew who you were fighting against. And then you had all these tunnels that allowed people to move around and you wouldn't know where they were coming from or where they were going. And so part of what the Americans did was check these tunnels. and blow them up. And so they have things high explosives, 68 pounds of explosives to blow up the tunnels. They carried wiring and detonators. Dave Jensen carries earplugs. Before blowing the tunnels, they were ordered by higher command to search them, which was considered bad news. But by and large, they just shrugged and carried out orders. Because he was a big man, Henry Dobbins was excused from tunnel duties. He wouldn't fit down there, but the others would draw numbers. Before Ted Lavender died, there were 17 men in the platoon. Whoever draw the number 17 would strip off his gear and crawl in headfirst with a flashlight and Lieutenant Cross's .45 caliber pistol. That's it. Then the rest of them would fan out and they would kneel down and listen to the ground beneath them. So very scary, like you could just be immediately killed down there. You would worry about what you might find in the tunnel, like would your flashlight die? Are there rats down there? And if they have rabies, if you screamed, would anybody hear you? The imagination of what could happen was almost more scary than truly meeting your death in some ways. So on this particular day, Lee Strunk draws the number 17, and he tries to handle this, courageously. He tries to laugh, and he gets down there quickly, and the morning was hot and still. Kiowa has a premonition things are not good. He says this isn't good. He looked at the tunnel opening and then out across a dry paddy towards the village of Thankay. Nothing moved, no clouds or birds. As they waited, the men smoked and drank Kool-Aid, not talking much, feeling sympathy for Lee Strunk, but also feeling lucky that they weren't down there themselves. You win some, you lose some, said Mitchell Sanders, and sometimes you settle for a rain check. It was a tired line and no one laughed. Henry Dobbins ate a tropical chocolate bar. Ted Lavender popped a tranquilizer and went off to pee. After 5 minutes, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross moved to the tunnel, leaned down, and examined the darkness. Trouble. He's like, where is he, right? And then suddenly, without willing it, he was thinking about Martha. The stresses and the fractures, the quick collapse, the two of them buried alive under all that weight, dense, crushing love. He sort of thinks about his feelings and love for Martha in the same way as being crushed in a tunnel. He tried to concentrate on Lee Strunk, but his love was too much for him. He felt paralyzed. And then he describes how obsessed he is again. He's so distracted. Lieutenant Cross gazes into the tunnel, but he was not there. He was buried with Martha under the white sand at the Jersey shore. They were pressed together, and the pebble in his mouth was her tongue. He was smiling, so he just can't handle how much he misses her. And I have this starred. He was just a kid at war, in love. He was 24 years old. He couldn't help it. So I think this is very important. I know that many times you'll read other books about World War I and World War II. I think All Quiet on the Western Front, one of the soldiers is 19 years old. 24, even though that's 5 years older, is not actually that much older when it comes to facing something like this. 24 years old is still a young adult, young being the most important word here, not really ready for this kind of hardship, and for Lieutenant Cross's perspective, this kind of leadership. He's probably one of the older people, honestly, in the group because he has a higher rank. Then out comes Lee Strunk. So he makes it. He comes up grinning, filthy but alive. Lieutenant Cross nodded and closed his eyes while the others clapped, Strunk on the back, and made jokes about rising from the dead. Worms, Rat Kiley said, right out of the grave. Zombie, the men laughed. They all felt great relief because it's just scary. Spook City, said Mitchell Sanders. Lee Strunk made a funny ghost sound, a kind of moaning, yet very happy, and right then, when Strunk made that high, happy, moaning sound, when he went ahoo, right then, Ted Lavender was shot in the head on his way back from peeing. So this is important. This is how he died. He went off to pee, and as he's coming back, he's shot in the head. So somewhere out there in those, on that field or in those, trees, there was one of the Vietnamese. He lay with his mouth open. His teeth were broken. There was a swollen black bruise under his left eye. The cheekbone was gone. Oh shit, Rat Kiley said. The guy's dead. The guy's dead, he kept saying. which seemed profound. The guy's dead. I mean, really. The things they carried were determined to some extent by superstition. Okay, so again, we just jump right out of the plot and back to what they carry. And remember, I mentioned that they were superstitious. Lieutenant Cross has the pebble. Dave Jensen has a rabbit's foot. Norman Boker carries a thumb. Okay, so that causes a pause. Mitchell Sanders had given it to him. The thumb was dark brown, rubbery at the touch, and weighed 3 ounces at most. It had been cut off from a Viet Cong corpse, a boy of 15 or 16. They found him at the bottom of an irrigation ditch, badly burned, flies in his mouth and eyes. The boy wore black shorts and sandals. At the time of his death, he'd been carrying a pouch of rice, a rifle, and 3 magazines of ammunition. You want my opinion, Mitchell Sanders said. There is a definite moral here. He put his hand on the dead boy's wrist. He was quiet for a time as if counting a pulse. And then he used Kiowa's hunting hatchet and cut off his thumb. So this is another example of like how dealing with death becomes incredibly weird. What a strange thing to do. We can't really give any reason or logical explanation for this except for this is how they deal with it. It's just happening all the time. Sanders wraps the thumb in toilet paper and gives it to Norman Boker. There was no blood or anything. It's just this little thumb. And he keeps it as like a good luck charm. It goes on to say more things they carried. I mean, just a huge list here of all the different things, stationaries and bags with iced beer and soda pop and all kinds of stuff. They take turns with the scrambler radio, which weighs 30 pounds. They shared the weight of memory. They took up what others could no longer bear. Often they carried each other, the wounded or the weak. They carried infections. They carried chess sets and basketballs and Vietnamese English dictionaries. They carried diseases, malaria and dysentery, lice and ringworm and leeches and paddy algae and various rots and mold. They carried the land itself, Vietnam, the place, the soil, a powdery orange-red dust that covered their boots and fatigues and faces. They carried the sky, the whole atmosphere. They carried it, the humidity, the monsoons, the stink of fungus and decay, all of it. They carried gravity. They moved like mules. By daylight, they took sniper fire. At night, they were mortared, but it was not battle. It was just the endless march, village to village without purpose, nothing won or lost. This is very important. And I just notice how it's just like tucked in here in the middle of this very long paragraph. This is a commentary about the war. This is what Americans felt about the Vietnam War, that we had no business there, that it could not be won or lost, that it was just, without purpose. And so a lot of the soldiers felt that way too. Certainly people back home, once they got a clear picture of what was happening, definitely felt that way, which is what fueled many of the protests against the war. They carried their own lives. It's also interesting what kind of things were given to them. At various times when supplies would get dropped off, they would get things like sparklers for the 4th of July, colored eggs for Easter. It was the great American war chest, the fruits of science. There was at least a single abiding certainty that they would never be at a loss for things to carry. After the chopper, now we're back to the plot. After the chopper took Lavender away, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross led his men into the village of Than Cay, and they burned everything. So they torched this place as revenge for what happened to Ted Lavender. They shot chickens and dogs. They trashed the village well. They called in artillery and watched the wreckage. And then they marched for several hours through the hot afternoon. And then at dusk, while Kiowa explained how Lavender died, Lieutenant Cross found himself trembling. So he has a bit of a breakdown. He tried not to cry. With his entrenching tool, which weighed 5 pounds, he began digging a hole in the earth. He was ashamed. He hated himself. He had loved Martha more than his men. And as a consequence, Lavender was now dead. And this was something he would have to carry like a stone in his stomach for the rest of the war. So we don't know yet how Lieutenant Jimmy Cross could have saved Ted Lavender or could have prevented this from happening. We will get information about that later. But I mean, they're out there. Maybe they should have checked more. Is anybody around? maybe they should have fanned out a little bit and made sure, that there was no one watching, or maybe somebody should have gone with Ted Lavender, especially given the fact that most of the time he was heavily tranquilized, or else he was high on the dope he was smoking. It goes on. Kiowa comes back to the story of seeing Ted Lavender die. He says, "I swear to God, boom, not a word." "I've heard this," said Norman Boker, so they're getting annoyed at this. "Still zipping himself up, zapped while zipping," he makes a joke. "All right, fine, that's enough." "Yeah, but you had to see it. The guy just, I heard, man. Why not shut the fuck up?" So Kiowa keeps talking about this. And I made a note that this is contradictory because Kiowa is the one who carries the Bible. He's the one who's a Baptist. It makes me wonder, just like, why would he be so crude about death again and again? I mean, it's one thing to say it the first time, but then to say it again and again, especially when you can tell the people you're with don't want to hear it, seems kind of, I don't know, just a contradiction in his character. After a time, Kiowa sighed. "One thing's for sure," he said, "the lieutenant's in some deep hurt. I mean, that crying jag, the way he was carrying on, it wasn't fake or anything. It was real heavy-duty hurt. The man cares." So when Lieutenant Jimmy Cross digs this little hole and sits down there and cries, and this is what's described here, Kiowa thinks that that's because he feels so bad about the loss of Ted Lavender, but in fact, it's because he feels so ashamed that happened and that he wasn't paying attention. So finally, Kiowa pulls off his boots. He wanted to say more just to lighten up his sleep. Okay, so now we're getting some insight. He's saying these things for his own benefit. He's trying to make light of it so he can deal with it himself in terms of Ted Lavender's death. Instead, he opened his New Testament and arranged it beneath his head as a pillow. The fog made things seem hollow and unattached. He tried not to think about Ted Lavender, but then he was thinking how fast it was, no drama, down and dead, and how it was hard to feel anything except surprised. It seemed unchristian. Yes, that's kind of what I was saying over here. He wished he could find more great sadness or even anger, but the emotion wasn't there, and he couldn't make it happen. Mostly, he felt pleased to be alive, which makes a lot of sense. He liked the smell of the New Testament under his cheek, the leather and ink and paper and glue, whatever the chemicals were. He liked hearing the sound of night. Even his fatigue, it felt fine. The stiff muscles and the prickly awareness of his own body. He's alive. Lying there, Kiowa admired Lieutenant Jimmy Cross's capacity for grief. Again, Kiowa's clueless as to why Jimmy Cross is crying. We know it's because he feels responsible. We do have a sort of racist comment here. After a moment, Norman Boker sat up in the dark. "What the hell," he said to Kiowa. "You want to talk? Talk. Tell it to me. Forget it." "No, man, go on. One thing I hate, it's a silent Indian." So Kiowa's sense that maybe he doesn't quite fit in with the white men is definitely confirmed here a little bit. Just a minor, small little dig, just like focusing on that there is a difference between them. And it goes on again. For the most part, they carried themselves with poise. Now and then, however, there were times of panic, when they squealed or wanted to squeal but couldn't, when they twitched and made moaning sounds and covered their heads and said, "Dear Jesus," and flopped around on the earth and fired their weapons blindly and cringed and sobbed and begged for the noise to stop and went wild and made stupid promises to themselves and to God and to their mothers and fathers, hoping not to die. So this is like the sheer terror of losing your life. In different ways, it happened to all of them. So this is universal. It goes on over here. They used a hard vocabulary to contain the terrible softness. Greased, they'd say, offed, lit up, zapped while zipping. So they would use these crude, sort of comical descriptions of death as a way of keeping themselves from falling apart from the terror of it. When someone died, it wasn't quite dying because in a curious way it seemed scripted, and because they had their lines mostly memorized, irony mixed with tragedy, and because they called it by other names, as if to insist and destroy the reality of death itself. They kicked corpses. They cut off thumbs. They talked grunt lingo. They told stories about Ted Lavender's supply of tranquilizers, how the poor guy didn't feel a thing, how incredibly tranquil he was. So this is how they handle it, because otherwise they would lose their mind. They were waiting for Ted Lavender's chopper, smoking the dead man's dope. The moral's pretty obvious, Sanders said and winked. Stay away from drugs. They'll ruin your day every time, which of course is somewhat true. It also says that the men were tough. And of course, what we just read on the previous pages helps us understand how they are tough. They carried all the emotional baggage of men who might die. They carried the soldier's greatest fear also, which was the fear of blushing. So they don't want to show their feelings. They don't want to show that they're embarrassed or that they're, afraid or anything like that. They're trying to keep all of that inside. Men killed and died because they were embarrassed not to. It was what had brought them to the war in the first place. Nothing positive, no dreams of glory or honor, just to avoid the blush of dishonor. This is also, I think, an important theme in this book, and we're going to see this come up again. They died so as not to die of embarrassment. They crawled into tunnels and walked point and advanced under fire. Each morning, despite the unknowns, they made their legs move. They endured. They did not submit to the obvious alternative, which was simply to close the eyes and fall. So easy, really. Go limp and tumble to the ground and let the muscles unwind and not speak and not budge until your buddies picked you up. Like, so easily they could just give up, right? It says, they spoke bitterly about guys who had found release by shooting off their own toes and fingers. So this did happen. People who couldn't handle it anymore would injure themselves so that they would be sent back to America. They would make fun of these people. But they also dreamed of freedom birds. At night on guard, staring into the dark, they were carried away by jumbo jets. So they also imagined just being put on an airplane and sent home. Wouldn't that be amazing? They felt the rush of takeoff, just gone. And then velocity, wings and engines, a smiling stewardess, like they could just be gone. And this would no longer be their reality. And then it just goes on to describe just the whole daydream of just being sent back to America, how they would go to McDonald's. It was a flight, a kind of fleeing, a kind of falling, gone. I'm sorry, but I'm gone. This is what they would love to be able to do, but they don't let themselves think about it. It says here, on the morning after Ted Lavender died, First Lieutenant Jimmy Cross crouched at the bottom of his foxhole and burned Martha's letters. Then he burned the 2 photographs. There was a steady rain falling, which made it difficult, but he used heat tabs and sterno to build a small fire, screening it with his body, holding the photographs over the tight blue flame with the tips of his fingers. So I just want to point out, first of all, the difference here in syntax. So I have a note. Syntax is sentence structure. This whole section describing how they imagine getting on an airplane and going home is written almost as if it's one long sentence. There are hardly any periods in here. So when you see very, very long sentences that just seem to go on, it creates momentum. It can create a feeling of anxiety. It can show anxiety. In this case, it can also show like how your mind just wanders and wanders and wanders, and they are definitely imagining going home. And when you're imagining something, there are no sentences. It's just words that kind of tumble through your brain, and that's what we see here. And then we shift back to more traditional syntax, which is what Jimmy Cross is doing. And this is all very symbolic. To burn the letters is to try to disconnect himself from his obsession with her. The fact that there is rain falling symbolizes a cleansing or a fresh start. So hopefully he's going to try and be a new person. He does acknowledge that he can't maybe burn the blame, but he can burn the distraction, which is what he's trying to do. He goes on over here to say he loved her, but he hated her because she doesn't return his feelings. He tells himself no more fantasies. He tells himself that Kiowa was right. boom, down, and you were dead, never partly dead. So he's just like, that's the reality. You know, it's about life and death. I can't be thinking about Martha. It was very sad, he thought, the things men carried inside, the things men did or felt that they had to do. He almost nodded at her, but didn't. So he's looking at that picture that he's burning, and he's just realizing, like, she's not real. I mean, she's a real person, but the relationship that he's imagining isn't real. He's obsessed with a dream, and it's dangerous for him to do that. And it's sad that he feels like he has to burn her picture, but he feels like he does have to do that. He tells himself from this point on, he would act like an officer. On the march, he would impose strict field discipline. He would send out flank security to prevent straggling or bunching up. He would insist on clean weapons. He would confiscate the remainder of Lavender's dope. Yeah, these guys shouldn't be high. They have too much at stake. Later in the day, perhaps, he would call the men together and speak to them plainly. He would accept the blame for what had happened to Ted Lavender. He would be a man about it. He would look them in the eyes, keeping his chin level, and he would issue the new standard operating procedures in a calm, impersonal tone of voice. Commencing immediately, there would be no longer abandoning equipment along the route of the march. They would police up their acts. They would get their shit together and keep it together. He would not tolerate laxity. He would show strength, distancing himself. So he says here that he reminded himself that his obligation was not to be loved, but to lead. He would dispense with love. It was not now a factor. So, like, it's not about a popularity contest with these guys. He needs to be tough. And if anyone quarreled or complained, he would simply tighten his lips and arrange his shoulders in the correct command posture. He might give a curt little nod, or he might not. He might just shrug and say, carry on. Then they would saddle up and form into a column and move out toward the villages west of Than Khe. So he's finding a way to move on and to make sure that he doesn't let anything careless happen again that could cause someone's death.